Sup guys, this is the third part of my in-depth planes guide for Azur lane. In the first two parts, I went through all three of the main plane types, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, and what makes a plane good in each one relative to their own categories. I haven't talked about seaplanes yet, and will briefly go over them at the end with all the extra stuff like anti-submarine equipment and anti-submarine torpedoes. Although I believe if you have learned everything from the first two parts, you should be able to judge which seaplanes are the best already. They're not complicated at all, especially when compared to regular planes. This part is basically a bonus part because part 2 ended up being a bit too long to include everything. It's going to build off the first two parts, so you should definitely watch those first if you haven't already. The playlist containing them will be linked in the description. Okay, starting off with fighters. Conventional fighters have the best anti-air but worst surface damage out of all planes. They drop bombs that are in all cases weaker than what you can find in the dive bomber class, and they still retain the 0.8 aviation scaling that dive bombers do. Their most obvious use case is going to be for campaigns chapters 13 and 15, where enemy planes are a major obstacle, but they can also deal more damage than rocket fighters when you're fighting multiple enemies at the same time due to the AoE of bombs. As mentioned in part 1, the best fighter for interception while still doing respectable damage is the flying flapjack. I can't exactly quantify how much better the flapjack is than the next best fighter when it comes to interception, but I can confidently say that its low flight speed and intercept cooldown make it significantly better than all the others, and it can really be felt in chapter 15. The other type of fighter is the rocket fighters. They do not intercept at all, but their damage is very good and single target focused, so it follows that they're not very useful in chapters 13 and 15, or chapter 14 for that matter due to the concealment mechanic. If you want to learn how chapter 14's concealment mechanic make rocket fighters and other sources of aimed damage worse, there is a brief 3-minute video in the description which explains it thoroughly. The best rocket fighters, the LA9 and HVAR, deal the most damage against medium and second most damage against light armor respectively, on a per strike basis. Take a ship like Illustrious, who has 2 decently strong fighter slots. Putting aside her skill for a second, since most of her loadout is fighters, it will reflect the strengths and weaknesses of fighters. Therefore, compared to other carriers which may not have as many fighters, for example Taiho, Illustrious with her loadout is much better at interception and dealing damage to a single light or medium armor enemy. Again, I'm just purely talking about loadouts for now, using these two carriers as examples without accounting for their skills, which may or may not change the analysis of how they compare against each other. Next up is dive bombers. The stars of this class are the Tenrai and the AD-1 Skyraider. In general, dive bombers deal the most AoE damage, but due to their 0.8 aviation scaling and inconsistent hit rate, they fall behind the other plane types on average against single target enemies. For example, looking at the Tenrai against its best armor type, which is heavy, after adjusting its average damage by multiplying it by 0.8 to account for its lower aviation scaling, it deals on average 783 damage, which is only about 75% of the converging VIT torpedo bomber against heavy armor. Their AoE also makes them slightly more consistent against enemies that aren't slowed at all, but not using roots or slows and relying on dive bombers to hit their load will often lead to poor results anyway, so you should really just find a way to keep the target still and hit them with the strongest targeted damage instead. The AD-1 is special when it comes to dive bombers because it also carries with it HVAR rockets, which means it comes with the strengths and weaknesses of rockets. On a per strike basis, it deals the most damage against a single light armor target, but as you can expect from rockets, it does not have much AoE. While it's the strongest dive bomber against a single target medium armor enemy as well, due to its lower aviation scaling, it is severely outclassed by the LA9 against medium armor and weaker than converging torpedo bombers as well. Additionally, it's extremely slow and there's a good chance that, unless you adjust some other parts of your loadout with it, your carrier could end up launching one less airstrike within a given time frame, decreasing their total damage output. Let's take a look at Hakuryu, who is a carrier with one of, if not the strongest dive bomber slot. She has much more AoE than a carrier like Illustrious, as conventional fighters are just weaker dive bombers when it comes to their bombs, and if you use the Skyraider rather than the Tenrai in that dive bomber slot, she becomes a light armor assassin instead. However, with only one fighter slot, her interception and anti-medium damage would not be as impressive. Again, I'm not making these statements about the carriers, but just using their loadouts as examples. In reality, Haku is obviously going to deal more damage than Illustrious against medium armor when taking into account her stats and skills. Finally, we get to torpedo bombers. Parallel torpedo bombers, which is just the Wyvern really, are only good when there are multiple enemies, as is the case in campaign. All the bombs in a single airstrike pretty much drop simultaneously. On the other hand, torpedoes continue traveling toward the end of the screen until they hit something or reach the end. What this means is that they can and often will hit multiple waves of enemies due to extra torps that continue to travel on screen as the next wave of enemies spawn in. This often happens when a carrier launches when there are only 1 or 2 enemies left, or they're overkilling the stage, as most of the torps will not go to waste like bombs in those situations. With the combination of having really good anti-air and the ability to hit multiple waves of enemies, I tend to gravitate toward carriers with a torpedo bomber bias while doing mobbing, for example Independence, Shinano, and Aquila, to take advantage of Wyverns. However, as loadout isn't the only thing that matters, there are dive bomber focused carriers such as Saratoga, who also excel at mobbing, but that is because their skills compensate in other ways and not because there are a lot of situations where dive bombers are better than torpedo bombers. Since the Wyvern can intercept, you might be wondering how it compares to the fighters in that department. It can't quite compare to the Flapjack, but it is about as good as other bomb-carrying fighters, and is enough to make a noticeable difference when using it over a plane that does not intercept. Interception does not only help keep your main fleet ships alive, but is also important for carriers to stay concealed. Concealment will usually increase the damage of your carriers by somewhere between 30 to 50%, so it is definitely worth sacrificing some raw damage for interception sometimes, if it makes the difference between being hidden and revealed. For example, in the Helena meta fight, there are a few enemy planes. Definitely not enough to threaten your main fleet's survival, but easily enough to reveal your carriers if you don't have any interception. In terms of raw damage, the best options are obviously the H-4 rocket planes for fighter slots, and a converging torpedo bomber or spearfish for the torpedo bomber slots. However, those planes all have no interception, so you're pretty much guaranteeing that your carriers will be revealed. Now, this may be unnecessary, but you can potentially replace 1 or 2 of your H-4s with Flying Flapjack, or replace your converging torpedo bomber with a Wyvern if the change can lead to your carriers being concealed where they otherwise wouldn't. Sacrificing some damage on one slot for a 30% increase on all 3 carriers is obviously worth it, but keep in mind that there are other factors involved as well. For example, what if your carriers are not revealed for every airstrike without interception, but only half of them? Then the damage increase would only be 15% rather than 30%. And what if instead of 1 or 2 planes, you need to replace 3 or 4 planes with intercepting planes in order to stay hidden? Then what you're getting out of staying concealed might not be able to compensate for the amount of raw damage you're sacrificing. In any case, this is a strategy that only very rarely comes in handy, but is relevant enough to be worth knowing in my opinion. Fighter anti-air damage scales off aviation, so concealment bonus also affects it. Keeping your carriers concealed will lead to them being better at anti-air, whereas being revealed will lead to decreased anti-air performance and then taking even more damage. There are also converging torpedo bombers, which are simply the strongest against single target heavy armor enemies, and the second best against medium after rocket fighters. Putting it all together, you should now have a pretty good gauge on a carrier's strengths and weaknesses when you see their loadout. For example, looking at Yorktown 2's loadout, you can see that she must run 1 dive bomber with potentially 2 fighter slots. From that, you should be able to deduce that her anti-air interception would be strong if you were to give her flapjacks, and she can also melt light armor enemies with a loadout of H-4s and Sky Raider, or medium armor enemies with LA-9s and Sky Raider. But her damage in single target heavy armor fights will suffer because she does not carry many torpedo bombers in that situation. As another example, let's look at Shinano. She can carry a lot of torpedo bombers and dive bombers, which makes her good in mobbing situations and dealing with heavy armor bosses, but she'll have a bit of trouble against light armor enemies, as she can have at most 2 fighters while being stuck with 4 torpedo bombers. Something to pay attention to when looking at carrier loadouts is not only the slots, but the plane count in each slot as well as efficiency. For example, let's take a look at Chkalov's loadout. She has 2 dive bomber slots but only 1 torpedo bomber slot. However, her 1 torpedo bomber slot has 4 torpedo bombers at 155% efficiency, which is stronger than both her dive bomber slots combined. Even though she has more dive bomber slots than torpedo bombers, her torpedo bombers are stronger, and it is more important that she has a strong torpedo bomber than dive bombers. One last thing for newer players. Certain carriers will do a lot better with budget equipment than others. For example, let's look at Ark Royal. She's at her best against a single heavy armor enemy, and her best loadout for that is converging torpedo bombers in the first and third slot, and Tenrai in the second. If you don't have the very best options, your budget loadout will be something like 2 Tenzin Kais and SB2C. Tenzin Kais are 95% as good as gold torpedo bombers, and SB2C is about 75% of the Tenrai, so the budget loadout is probably 90% as good as the real thing, assuming that all equipment are at plus 10. On the other hand, let's take a look at Enterprise, who, with her powerful fighter and dive bomber slots, is a really good carrier for dealing with single-target light armor enemies. Her best loadout for that role is the F6F HFAR, 81 Skyraider, and then Fairy Spearfish. However, if you only have access to budget equipment, you'll probably be using something like the regular F6F Hellcat, SB2C Helldiver, and Tenzin Kai. It's entirely possible that you made the right choices, and this really is the best equipment you have available for Enterprise. But unlike Ark Royal's budget setup, this is only going to be about 50% as effective as the real thing, if even. You may see carriers being used to great success against light armor bosses in Operation Siren or meta fights. As you've learned through these guides, HFAR rockets and Skyraider deal a lot of damage against light armor targets, but they are both event limited. If you do not have these, especially if you're new, then this budget setup might really be the best that you can do. This is a perfectly viable loadout for a newer player who doesn't have access to endgame equipment yet, and it works very well against the enemies that these equipment excel against, which is going to be heavy armor, but they are extremely weak against light armor. If you do not have access to HFARs and Skyraiders, or just don't have the excess resources to raise a bunch of them to plus 13, Battleship HE works very well against light armor, so HFAR should be lower priority in the grand scheme of things compared to some of the other good planes, in particular the LA-9s, converging torpedo bombers, and Tenrais. If you've used carriers against light armor enemies just because you've seen someone else do it, and it didn't work nearly as well as you expected it to, you should now understand why exactly it did not work out. I noticed that players who follow equipment templates without understanding the choices they're making tend to fall into traps like these. I also recommend checking out the equipment scaling video linked in the description if you haven't already. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you found it informative. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.